Some people ask me if there's evidence for Jesus outside the Bible, and there is. There are some early non-Christian witnesses to Jesus. One of them is Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian employed by the Romans who wrote a history of the Jewish war against Rome and a history of the Jewish people called the Antiquities. In Book 20 of the Antiquities, Josephus refers to the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, which nearly all scholars believe is authentic. What's more controversial is Book 18 of the Antiquities, where Josephus says this: "About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds, and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared." Most scholars believe Josephus did refer to Jesus, but that this passage has been subject to Christian revisions over time. That's because Josephus was an unconverted Jew, so he would never have said Jesus was the Messiah or the Christ. But scholars don't think the entire passage is a forgery, because there are other phrases that make it unlikely a Christian invented the whole thing, which itself would also be unheard of because Christians did not alter Josephus anywhere else, nor did they alter the first century text of the Jew Philo, who discussed ideas relevant to Christianity but never mentions Jesus. For example, the passage in Josephus calls Jesus a wise man, which is not a Christian description of Jesus because it makes it sound like Jesus was merely a man. Likewise, Josephus says that Christians belong to a tribe, but Christians did not describe themselves in this way. T.C. Schmidt has published a book called Josephus and Jesus. Schmidt has done extensive word analysis of the passage to show that the vocabulary adheres to Josephus's style. It's not something the typical forger would produce. Other manuscripts show that the phrase "he was the Christ" was probably rendered "he was called Christ," which matches what Josephus says in Book 20. Also, if a Christian had interpolated the phrase, they probably would have said Jesus is the Christ in the present tense. Likewise, the phrase "if he be called a man" is probably not from a Christian revision, but from Josephus thinking Jesus may have been a wonder worker or a sorcerer. And the line about Jesus appearing to the disciples on the third day probably went more like this given the grammar of the passage and the textual evidence. Josephus was describing what the disciples believed without necessarily endorsing their beliefs. Finally, mythicists who say Jesus never existed often claim that even if some version of this passage were authentic, this doesn't prove anything because Josephus probably got his information from second-generation Christians who may have already believed in a mythic spiritual Jesus, but Schmidt shows that when Josephus uses sources, he often copies phrases word for word, which he doesn't do with any of the Gospels. And the nature of Josephus's description makes more sense coming from a Jewish source, possibly a member of the Sanhedrin itself.